It's an absolute honor and a pleasure to get to speak to you. As you know, I've set out this ridiculous goal of running a 5-minute mile. It's mad. I hope I achieve it. But I mean, essentially, the basis behind it is the vitality data that shows how important physical activity is and the power it has on mental health, etc. But the higher purpose is around the concept of setting goals, really invoking, loss aversion, that there's something to lose and it motivates change. I've had the most unbelievable time speaking to remarkable people, Sebastian Coe, Wade van Niekerk, so people in the athletic space. I've been amazed at not only discovering the power of the goals and what they mean to our original hypothesis, but just talking to them about how setting goals, the discipline required, the pain required, the meaning it gives people. They discovered the human potential, the why, the purpose. It's kind of a whole world that's kind of come out of it that I found really inspiring. So having you is a real pleasure. You have been advising, supporting, giving counsel to leaders of business, chairpersons, CEOs, leaders of government around human potential, how they should think about leadership. So in this context, it's a wonderful, wonderful pleasure to have you. Let me just start maybe by, the fact that you developed really some incredibly complex tools and ideas in the potential of people around coherence and meaning. The concept of flow, because I was taken aback by Sebastian Coe. There were 41 heady days in his career where he broke 3 world records, and he seemed to be, everything came easy to him. Everything was, I'm not sure that's flow, but your concept of flow and its relevance in meaning and resilience in people. And in this context, I'm just intrigued to hear, as a start, your thoughts.
Well, I think it's important to be clear that the original work on flow was done by a man called Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who was a Hungarian American. And he was interested, he was very conscious of the fact that a lot of psychology tended to look at where things were going wrong, where people were distressed. And he wanted to look at and to understand more about situations where people felt, as you just described, competent, they felt a sense of agency, they just felt energy coming to them. And so he started by just listening literally to people from all kinds of backgrounds. So ice skaters, surgeons, motorbike riders in Japan. I'm not quite sure why they were in Japan, but and the word that came out again and again as they were describing this particular experience of just feeling completely at one with what they were trying to do was the notion of flow in these various different languages, different backgrounds. So he was living in Detroit at the time, and he thought, well, it can't be the case that everybody would ever feel this way at work, but I'd better just check, just in case. And to his astonishment, he found that there were people who had that experience at work, and at various different levels of work. So a lot in the motor industry at that time, fairly sort of straightforward assembly work and so on, but even work that appeared to demand relatively little, there were these situations where people experienced flow. And at the same, so I came across this work because I was trying to understand more about the way that people use judgment in making decisions, which came out of the work of someone who founded, the man who founded Bioss, Elliot Jacks. And so I spoke to Csikszentmihalyi and began to use his model, his ideas, because the point he had made was that if people are overwhelmed by the complexities and the challenges of what they're being asked to do, they become anxious and uncertain. And if you take that quickly into the organizational setting, they're likely to make decisions, either to rush decisions or delay decisions. So there are consequences for the organization they're operating in. Equally, if they're underwhelmed by the challenges, they become bored and switched off. They may try to make more of a situation than is really necessary. And they feel generally ununderstood, if there is such a word, and not respected and not appropriately heard. So on that basis, we developed a particular way of listening to people's stories about their working lives. and picking up more and more of exactly the same evidence that Jigsaw and I have picked up. And we refined it. I won't bother you by going into the detail, but we refined how it is for people when they are overwhelmed or underwhelmed, and the consequences for the organizations in which they are working and are responsible. And another thing that we became very clear about is that people's capability to cope with, or not cope, that's the wrong word, to engage with challenge and complexity is something that grows. And it grows in a way that, so people's capability, people often use the notion of their capability calls them. And it says there is something else here that needs to be done. And sometimes that's not the right moment in their lives, and they tend to sort of shush it away. But it comes back and says, no, you do want more complexity. You do want more challenge.
So I mean, that's a fascinating, inspiring concept. I mean, maybe my question, I hope it's not simplistic, is can you, through setting goals, setting a challenge, and whatever it is, can you accelerate? Can you somehow increase where that level of flow is? In other words, to your point, your capabilities get better potentially over time, but can you accelerate that capability by challenging yourself? Can you drive higher so flow occurs at a higher level of competence?
But I think the point is that there seems to be a natural path for people's capability to grow. And if you try to draw them, and they know that path, they may not be able to follow it because of constraints at work. So very often people's capability is misunderstood or underappreciated because of their gender or their ethnicity or their particular lack of education. And so it's possible to release capability that has not been appreciated and understood. And we see that, well, you see that a lot in the setting in which you work. And we see that all over the world.
I mean, let me ask you this. This is about our deep belief in the vitality discovery space around, everyone can be healthier, everyone can have a better life, within certain contexts. But this concept of setting a goal and trying to evoke loss aversion, that it forces you, it doesn't force you, it inspires you into a different space. I mean, a sense of generating hope and meaning. One thing I've seen, it's been fascinating. This is a physical activity goal, but it's taken me on kind of a journey. It's been quite remarkable. You've written a lot around this idea of pilgrimage, of journeys, can setting goals, are there explicit things we can do that can help us in our journeys to discover more about ourselves? Your perspectives on that?
I think there are two things. I think there's a significant difference between setting a goal for oneself and having goals set for you. And the latter is very much the whole point about leadership and how that is provided. But I think it would be reasonable to say that people are likely to experience flow more readily if they set their own goals in the way you've just described. That doesn't mean that I'm not suggesting idiosyncratic goals, and that's one of the main reasons why, of course, it's important to have a clear sense of purpose in an organization so that people's goals are properly aligned with that purpose.
You impose a goal on someone is a threatening, it might get results organizationally, but I'm not convinced it evokes self-improvement and a journey.
It doesn't, because it is disrespectful to that person. And it's not treating that person as a person, it's not treating people as people, but to create the conditions or the climate, the culture in which people set goals for themselves. And again, I don't mean idiosyncratically, but in a coherent way that makes sense of you. You know this well as I do, because it's how you lead to discovery.
You've written a lot about the 4 journeys of the leader, of the person. Just to get your sense of those 4 journeys and how are they inevitable? Can you evoke them in some way? We want to discover ourselves. Very
briefly, the idea of 4 journeys comes out of spending many, many hours listening to people talking about the stories of their working lives. And so the first, the journey of the self, goes back to the point I made earlier, that people's capability grows They seek wider challenges, more complexity, more connections to engage with. And as I said earlier, sometimes they can make the changes that will allow that to happen. Sometimes it'll take a while longer, but it's that sense of what happens over time. Then there's the public journey, which is the journey where people choose to put their capability into some working role. And that may mean that they have managerial responsibilities, leadership responsibilities. They may be a leading professional. And they are being public about the way that they understand complexity and can function within complexity. The third journey is the private journey, through which is the journey we share with people who are close to, so family, partners, children, close friends. And again, this is a slightly sort of side point, but the way in which so much work is now being done at home, with the consequences of that, blurs those two journeys. In some ways, that can be very helpful if there are children to be cared for or older people to be cared for at home. But the blurring of those journeys is something that people are very conscious of. And then the last journey is the personal journey, which is a journey through which people do or do not look after themselves. So they run, or they care for themselves in some other way physically, or they care for themselves by reflecting, or by playing music, or by walking. And I was very conscious in the note that you sent about the things that impressed you for the people who signed on to your initiative, that they are doing most of the ones you referred to are specifically in my language about that personal journey. And one of the things about the personal journey is that people often aren't aware of it until something either goes wrong or is particularly unusual in their other lives. And it gives them pause for thought, and they begin to reflect on themselves. So that personal journey is very precious and very important. Obviously, and the other point about it, the key point about it, is that it is the journey that weaves together the other journeys. Because, as I was saying a moment ago, the public and the private journeys can become not so much, the balance in the two can become very difficult to maintain that balance, particularly when people have very extensive roles, or they're traveling a lot, or whatever it may be.
I mean, my experience in my own life, but I think with the people I've worked with and led, you see a lot of unused potential. Very few people use their potential. I'm trying to ascertain, as a leader or as an individual, are there ways, I mean, goal setting may be one of them, but are there ways to accelerate that development? Are there ways to make sure that you pursue these journeys fully, that you really understand, as you said, the personal journey is a precious one?
I think, but from a leadership point of view, it's a question of providing the conditions in which people are treated properly and fully as people. And you may recall the notion of people being makers, in the sense the Scottish word for a poet is a maker. So people are makers of meaning, they're makers of decisions, they're members of families, of teams, of organizations, and so on. And at one point, when I was describing this to someone some years ago, they said to me, well, yes, but treating people as people is messy. And the man beside him said, oh, yes, but it's magic. One of the most significant ways in which, and I've seen this with a number of very senior executives, is that they always thank. They will thank for an email. They will send an email back within 10 minutes. All it has to say is many thanks, or just thanks. But it is quite remarkable how the link between that single act, if you like, that single acknowledgement and gratitude, and how people feel about the leadership of that person.
I mean, my question, when you do those kind of things, obviously it sends out a signal, but it has an equally powerful effect on the leader. In other words,
yes,
I think thanking people, giving people meaning, gives the person leading meaning. I mean, it's a two-way street. So it's kind of a virtuous cycle. You know what I found amazing, you've touched on it earlier in this journey of mine setting these goals. We've been inundated with people writing back with goals they've set, and you alluded to it. I mean, I'm kind of amazed by the profoundness of the goals, but often they have nothing to do with the public journey. You know, I've had people write to me with having got through serious, terrible cancer struggle with chemotherapy. Now they're going to run a mile. It's as if it's, you know, it seems not as profound as having got through the cancer, obviously. I've had an individual who's now learning to play a very complex piece of classical music, you know. But so there's a virtue in a goal in and of itself. It's not linked necessarily to one of the journeys, but it has a profound effect on meaning and resilience and you know, and hope. I mean, is that an appropriate thought process?
Well, I'd be inclined to link it to the personal journey, because I think it is often when people have been very ill or have suffered a grievous loss, or something has disturbed or disrupted the way that their life has been, that's when they begin to be much more aware of a personal journey, of another aspect of themselves that they perhaps haven't even been conscious of.
In a world now which just seems like incredible risk, uncertainty, you know, we've been through a pandemic, we have a war in Europe that could really trigger worse things, we have real economic difficulty in all different countries. It's kind of there's an overlays of real difficulty. So people are correctly anxious. I mean, what advice do you give around resilience and around hope? You know, how do you think about that, and how do we help people? Again, I mean, our hypothesis is, you know, just focusing on step-by-step progress and giving people hope. I again think that setting goals in difficult times, even if they're the personal goals, which are, you know, the personal journey, gives you a sense of meaning. You know, how do you get coherence and resilience in these difficult times?
Well, again, I go back to Viktor Frankl, whom you quoted, and another author, a sociologist, I think it was, called Antonovsky, who looked at resilience. He particularly, Antonovsky's work was with women in Israel who had grown up, had grown up during the time of the Holocaust, and he assumed that they would be less resilient, they would be more fragile as they moved into sort of middle age and later. And as he put it, because he was a sociologist, he'd never actually spoken to any individuals. So he decided he'd better go out and speak to some individuals. And he was hugely impressed by the courage and the clarity and the resilience of these women. And he, like Viktor Frankl, came to the view that was meaningfulness that was the key element for them in feeling in their resilience. That if there was some way in which they could give meaning, both at the time when things were so difficult for them and as they grew older, if they could give meaning to that, and meaning usually carries with it some hope, then they were more resilient. And his work has been used in various different settings, particularly in the States, to encourage the resilience of, for example, parents with a severely disabled child. Maybe it's, I'm not sure, but I just suddenly thought maybe it is because in that, if there is a crisis of some kind, people have to actually think about making meaning. Because often meaning, one just assumes, well, this is this and that's that, and this is good and that's not so good. But when things are particularly demanding, people have to actually pause and think, what is this about? What can I do? What does it mean? What does it hold within it for the future?
It may be a catalyst to finding meaning where,
yes,
you know, difficult times. I mean, the sense, you know, some of the research I've seen, I think it is a critical issue, and it also is in a goal-setting issue, is giving people a sense of agency. I mean, your earlier point about imposing goals versus setting your own. When you set your own, you have agency, you're in control.
Yes.
Is agency a critical piece of resilience and hope and meaning?
It is, and I'll come back to it in a second. It is a critical part of being able to use one's own judgment at work, because using one's own judgment is about bringing something that only you as an individual can bring to bear. And it gives, and that is as true of the judgment of someone who is working, as I was saying earlier, with data or with analyzing, as it is of someone with very extensive responsibilities. I think one of the things, I'm just thinking of conversations I've been having recently around the complexity of the external world, and the need to acknowledge that there are many more connections that now need to be attended to. Connections, geopolitical connections, risk connections. People are being asked to look across a much wider field and to see things that or to look for things they would not have seen before. And that, as much as anything, requires courage. Because for a long time, it's been entirely possible to lead an organization and be aware perhaps of its particular markets, its particular regulators. That is no longer sufficient. So there's a need for, yes, as I say, there's a need for courage to go out and look at context. I'm very conscious of the fact that there would have been a time when introducing the idea of context was of interest to senior executives, but not really something that they actually felt they needed to do something about. And that feels very different now.
You've given advice cross-sectionally over a long time to a lot of different people. I mean, the world now, as you say, it's demanding different things from leaders and people. You know, we're forced to find meaning, we're forced to take context into account. Is leadership getting better? In other words, are we tending people more? Are we learning these lessons? You know, what do you think?
I think it's an interesting way of looking at it. I think as organizations realize more and more how difficult it is, as we were saying earlier, to treat people as people, but that is actually necessary. The more uncertainty there is for people to deal with, the more you need people to exercise their judgment. And if they're going to use their judgment, they have to be treated as people. But having said that, it's not easy, as we were saying earlier. And when people are much pressured and all the rest, when senior executives are much pressured, to give the time to think, to listen, to be still and quiet with someone. It's not the way that most leaders have become accustomed over the last period of reasonably effective globalization. It's a different, now there are different patterns emerging. And so there's a need for acknowledging the hard work of the messiness of treating people as people, and the magic that ensues. It's not anything that you ever stop. The work of treating people as people, as I've just said, is tending. I'll give you a lovely phrase put to me by an Italian chief executive some years ago. He was saying, when you are caring for an organization and there is change around, every day you must dust, but some days you must also polish.
That's powerful. That's a wonderful way to end. Gillian, it's always an absolute honor to just listen to your wisdom, and you've been a mentor to me. I've learned just a huge amount. Every time I talk, every time we speak, I just learn more and just appreciate just your insights and wisdom. Thanks for doing this for us.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you.